My name is Evan Sharp. I'm from San Francisco, California. My background is in design and architecture. I was an architect in New York City for quite a while. After that, I was a designer at Facebook. And now I am the co-founder and the designer at a company called Pinterest. Now, I don't usually take the time to come out and speak, but this topic of how people discover things has been really important to the last few years of my life. And I thought I could do it justice by giving you guys a little bit of insight into what I've been working on at Pinterest. I also did a search on Pinterest for Venice, and it definitely helped convince me to come. So today I want to talk just a little bit about the work we've been doing at Pinterest, and then at the end a little bit about how I think the act of discovery will change over the next few years. For those of you that didn't raise your hand and are not familiar with Pinterest, Pinterest is a service that lets you collect all of the things you love into what we call pin boards, very much like a pin board in the physical space, a real pin board. It also lets you follow what other people are pinning, and it lets you discover new things through their collections. So opening Pinterest, visiting the website at its best, should feel like opening a catalog hand-picked for you by people who really share your taste, full of beautiful objects that you can then in turn repin to your boards if you think they're worthy. And one last point that I think is really important about how Pinterest is structured is that when you pin something and you find a pin on someone else's board, when you click on it, you can still end up back at the website that pin came from. So for example, if you pinned a t-shirt from tshirts.com, which is a website I made up, I hope it's not real. If you click on a pin from tshirts.com, it will take you back to the t-shirt on their website. So it stitches together boards with the internet. And just to give you a little bit of history, a little bit of the story of how Pinterest came into being, we started working on this quite a long time ago, back in November of 2009. At that time, I was actually in graduate school for architecture and doing a lot of kind of freelance web design on the side to help pay for it. And my friend Ben, who I'd always really thought was awesome, was also in New York. And the two of us got really excited about, actually the three or four of us got really excited about this idea of bringing collections online. We knew from our childhood, all of us had been very avid collectors, and we knew that at its best, a collection says a lot about who you are and what you love in the world. And we also know that historically, collections have been the way that humans have made sense of the world and understood it through science. And so here I was in architecture school. Here I was with this idea for collections with my friends. And what I thought Pinterest would be from the beginning was not this amazing kind of social network that it's become, but was much more just of a personal tool. Architecture school, like any creative discipline, it really requires a constant source of inspiration to keep you going. And I thought what Pinterest would become would be this great tool, this great way for us to collect the drawings and the photographs that we found inspiring. All of my classmates, they were all obsessed with finding better renderings, finding plans, finding sections from history to help them with the projects they were working on. And indeed, the school I was at in New York had spent the last 50 years, the last decades, amassing this huge, the world's largest actually, collection of architectural imagery. I think they have a couple 100,000 slides in what they call the slide library. It's this amazing resource of inspiration if you're an architect, but unfortunately, it's an architecture school, not a business school, and so they don't have the funding to bring it online, and so we had this amazing resource right at our fingertips, but we didn't have a great way to kind of use it to its fullest potential. And so that was the idea for me when I first started designing Pinterest. It was, how do we build this tool that will let people store their collections in a way that's accessible to them? But as soon as we started building it, I think what we realized was that we should do this for the whole world of objects, not just the world of architecture. After all, I think what makes the pinboard such kind of a timeless tool is its ability to accept anything, right? You can pin images to a pinboard, you can pin type, you can pin whatever you want. And so when we started thinking about how to do that online, we thought about building a system that was very flexible, that would let you pin many different types of images, many different types of videos in many different sizes, but still in a way that allowed us to show it back to people in a way that was really great for browsing. I didn't want it to feel like kind of the result of a database query, the way I feel that so many websites feel even to this day, but much more like a set of objects handpicked by a person, a very human way of presenting them. And so we did about, I think, 50 or 60 versions of this grid before we came up with the one on the site today. This was the first one back in November in 2009. Very, very bad, if I can say so. And then over the next month, here are some of the ones I still had in my folder, but I think 50 to 60 different versions of a grid. And ultimately what we came up with was what you see here, very similar to the site today. And the reason coming up with the right grid was so important was that the grid is literally the mechanism by which people browse. And how good the grid is depends on how good browsing is on Pinterest. So to kind of flesh this out, the reason this grid was so valuable, there are a couple of reasons. One was that it can accommodate any width of a screen. Another reason is that it doesn't have the hierarchy that so many websites have. There's no specific order for pins, and so that's not a distraction when you're thinking about what you're looking at. And I think the third thing was that when you add a pin into this grid, all of the rest of the pins reorder, and so every time you revisit the site, it looks fresh to you, even if only the last 5 pins, say, are new. And again, I think what makes this grid so important is that it really got to the idea of how people browse things digitally. Here's one definition of browse, of the word browse, the English word browse that I thought was very important, or that I thought was a good description of how I think of it. He says, a quick examination of the relevance of a number of objects, which may or may not lead to a closer examination. In other words, when you browse for something, you look through a field of many different things. And as you look, you find things that are more interesting, and you look at them closer. And if those are interesting, then maybe you buy them, maybe you do something to them, maybe you act on them. And if you think about that idea of browsing, and you compare it to how a lot of websites work even to this day, say you search for architecture drawings on Google, you don't get a field of things to browse, you get a list of websites. Who knows where those links go? On Twitter, you get a feed of tweets with those terms, but getting to what's behind them takes a long time. On Amazon, it's a little bit more interesting, but even on Amazon, there's a lot of wait to kind of getting to the actual drawings. And on Pinterest, of course, you can search for things, and so here's a search result for architectural drawings. I think it's probably a better way of browsing for those things, but even here, there's no kind of coherent narrative, and I think what really struck us when we built our first prototype was that by far the most interesting way to find things, to discover things, was by looking at the curated boards people had created. So in this case, a board about architectural drawings by one person, an architect in San Francisco in this case. So that focus that we came up with out of the prototype, that focus on browsing curated collections, quickly led us to add the follow button to boards. And the reason that was valuable is that now, instead of just being about collecting things, Pinterest was also about discovering new things, discovering things through what other people were collecting. And it sounds like a minor thing, but I think that was our big, big revelation. The idea that curating is actually a form of creation. That choosing what to include in a collection or what not to include is actually choosing a point of view, and that collecting is not just personal, but it's actually a way of expressing how you see the world. And that in turn, that expression of how you see the world compels other people to curate their point of view. And I think the result today is Pinterest. It's the reason we have billions of pins. It's that kind of cycle of seeing people's work and wanting to do your own. And so how will discovery change over the next few years? I mean, I think I started at the beginning by alluding to I'm still very much an architect at heart. And even though I draw a lot of inspiration from websites and apps, I think that I also draw a lot of inspiration from the lessons we've learned in organizing the physical world over the last several thousand years. And if you think about physical spaces that are organized for discovery, literally rooms based on discovery, the one thing that stands out to me is the fact that they're all based around a collection. Like a grocery store. A grocery store is nothing more than a collection of things to eat, put into a space, and organized in a way that helps you discover the things you're looking to eat that evening. This was a really great pasta store I found in Rome. This is an amazing, amazing Tupperware store, totally crazy. All sorts of colors in California. This is a bookstore. Bookstores are one of my favorite spaces of discovery. All of these objects you can walk up to and touch and read. Museums. I mean, the definition of a museum is an organization or institution organized around a collection. You can see that in the way they organize their space. And of course, libraries. And I think what's really interesting when you think about these examples is that you start to realize that many of the world's most interesting spaces and many of the world's most banal spaces are organized around a collection, and they're organized in such a way as to help you browse and discover the things within that collection that are relevant to what you're doing. And that collection could be all of human knowledge, like a library, or it could be things to eat. And central, I think the last point to make about this is that central to the idea of a collection is the idea, again, of curation, is the idea that there's a standard for a collection that you judge objects on. And I think that idea of curated collections is at the heart of Pinterest. It's at the heart of every store, every museum. It's at the heart of many of the key institutions in the world, and actually at the heart of many of the most valuable businesses. Curated collections are how we reduce the infinite variety of the world of objects down to a manageable world of related things. And to curate is to create an opinionated way of looking at the world. Think about how different it feels to browse a Prada store versus a department store versus a used thrift store. Think about how that one basic need, the need to clothe the human body, manifests itself so differently in so many different places, but always through a collection. And so in closing, I strongly believe that the future of discovery will happen in a world where the responsibility for curating the collections we browse is not in the hands of a few institutions or businesses, but actually in the hands of everyone on the internet. And I strongly believe that the future of discovery will happen in a world where everyone, no matter how uncreative or inexperienced, has the power to curate the world the way they see it for others to browse and enjoy. Grazie.